Welcome back, everybody, for another exciting edition of Western Civilization Part 1. So we're continuing on with the Roman Republic, and today's subject is going to be the Punic Wars, a very important set of wars that really defined Rome. And so we're going to look at those today. Our focus question is going to be, why did Rome's alliance system make the difference in its ultimate victory in the Punic Wars? So we talked about the alliance system in our last class, last lecture. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that, I would go back and listen to it, and we'll continue on. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at the wider Mediterranean world in the 260s when the Punic War broke out. So, of course, we have Rome dominating Italy here. We know that. To the east, over here in Greece, we've talked about these groups. These were the Greeks in the south and the Macedonians in the north. They dominated the Balkan Peninsula over here. Over to the east from Greece, the dominant power was a group we have already looked at a few lectures back, the Seleucid, one of the Hellenistic kingdoms. They're here in yellow. They dominated much of the Middle East and Asia Minor. To the south were the Ptolemies, and they were another one of these Hellenistic kingdoms dominating Egypt. And then another group we haven't looked at, and they're going to be the focus today, and these are the Carthaginians. Okay, so the Carthaginians are here in red, and they're based out of Carthage, which is just here in North Africa. Now, the Romans are going to come to blows with the Carthaginians. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, if they're coming to blows with the Carthaginians, why don't we call this the Carthaginian War? Well, good question. Carthage, I mentioned way back, was originally a colony of Phoenicia. Now, Phoenicia was way back. We talked about them in the early Iron Age. Phoenicia is located over here in modern-day Lebanon in the Levant. Well, Phoenicia was long gone, had long been subjugated, but its colony Carthage had become a great power itself and had expanded all across North Africa. It expanded into the islands around Italy here, Corsica, Sardinia, and especially into Sicily, which is going to be our focus. Now, it's important to talk a little bit about the social and economic world of the Carthaginians, because it was very different than the Romans. For one, like their Phoenician ancestors, the Carthaginians were a seafaring people. And I just realized I didn't say, well, why it's called the Punic War. Well, because Phoenician in Latin is pronounced Puni. And so the Phoenician or the Punic Wars, they were known as. And so, like their Phoenician ancestors, the Carthaginians were a great naval people. And this is different than Rome. Rome was a land-based power. Also, the Phoenicians were great traders, and so they had a commercial economy. This is different than Rome, which didn't have a commercial economy. They were pretty much an agricultural economy. The Carthaginians also made extensive use of a plantation-like system. They would have vast tracts of land, and this land was worked by slaves. Now, as far as their army went, the Carthaginians, didn't have that citizen army that Rome had. Remember, Rome's army was a citizen army based on volunteers, because a large part of the Carthaginian population were slaves who they couldn't arm. The Carthaginians relied on mercenary warfare. Okay, and so they were a different civilization than Rome in many ways. Well, this war between the Carthaginians and the Romans was going to break out over Sicily. Carthage is located right here, just off the coast of North Africa. The Romans were now dominating Italy, which is here, particularly the boot, and Sicily was right in between the two of them. And war would break out over who was going to control these straits, the Straits of Messina, as they are called. And this war broke out in 264. Now, initially, the Carthaginians had the advantage. And if you look at the map here for just a second, you'll see why. Sicily is an island. And in order to get to Sicily, the Romans were going to have to go by sea. And this would entail naval operations, something that the Romans just didn't have. But the Romans were a flexible and ingenious people, and they were soon able to copy and imitate washed up naval ships that they found. And the Romans were soon able to found a navy. Well, just because you have boats doesn't mean that you're very adept at it. And the Romans would face many setbacks. They were dominant on land when they got to Sicily, but the Carthaginians really were their betters on the sea. And so it was a pretty evenly matched war. And as you can see by the dates, it lasted for almost 25 years, a real back and forth battle. The decisive edge went to Rome because, well, they never gave up. They lost many battles, but ultimately they were able to grind down the Carthaginians, who, after all, were businessmen and started to find that the war was costing them too much. And so in 241, they sued for peace, and Rome came out victorious. They gained not only Sicily over here, they also gained these other islands off their coast, Corsica and Sardinia. And so these would become the first overseas territories that the Romans would acquire. They also imposed what's called an indemnity on the Carthaginians. Essentially, an indemnity means that you make the loser pay for the cost of the war. Now, the Carthaginians, I should mention, found these terms to be very harsh, and it left a bad taste in their mouth. And so it would only be a matter of time before hostilities would break out again. And so, after a lull of only about 20 years, the two powers found themselves at each other's throats. Now, in the intervening years, having lost Sicily, the Carthaginians focused their attention to the west, and they began to expand into the Iberian Peninsula, which is today dominated by Spain and Portugal, and is located right over here. The Carthaginians expanded their meager holdings along the southern coast, which they already had, and began to move further into Spain. This was a lucrative area full of mines and full of potential for the Carthaginians. Unfortunately, though, the Romans had relations with some of the Iberians, particularly the town of Saguntum, which is located on the west coast. The Saguntinians were allies of the Romans. And so they appealed to Rome for help. The Romans told the Carthaginians to back off. The Carthaginians refused, and the Romans and Carthaginians once again found themselves at each other's throats in 219 BC. Now, the Romans, for their part, expected this renewed hostility to be a naval war again. And so they fortified their southern coasts of Sicily, of Sardinia and Corsica, expecting a Carthaginian attack from this direction. However, the Carthaginians had an ace up their sleeve in the person of Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was the greatest Carthaginian general of all time, and really deserves credit as one of the greatest generals in all of human history. Being a great general, Hannibal did not attack the Romans where they expected it. Instead, he launched an ambitious mission to march across Spain, over hostile territories, which now is southern France, but at the time was inhabited by those wild Celts and Gauls, over into Italy and across the Alps, this very high mountain range that we talked about. Well, Hannibal had in his train 30,000 men, 6,000 horses, and 35 elephants. And so Hannibal's crossing of the Alps was one of those great historical events. Somehow, Hannibal managed to get his train of elephants over the Alps. An impressive feat, to say the least. And completely caught the Romans flat-footed. They definitely were not expecting elephants to be coming out of the Alps with a Carthaginian army in tow. Now, once in Italy, Hannibal was able to wreak havoc. The Romans came after him with armies, but Hannibal was always victorious. Army after army, Roman army after army was put down by Hannibal. He seemed invincible. And one battle, the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal was able to defeat a Roman army of 30,000 and wipe out the entire army before breakfast. And this was just one of the many defeats that Hannibal inflicted on the Romans. Worse yet, Hannibal portrayed himself as a liberator for the Italians. Said, "Come to my side. I will liberate you from the Romans." And so for 17 years, Hannibal marched up and down Italy, defeating Romans and trying to break up their empire. Well, this was bad news for the Romans. For one, Hannibal was mowing down armies. And for two, there was the potential that some of their allies might jump over to the Roman side. But here the Roman alliance system really began to pay off. The Italians, for the most part, didn't feel like prisoners of the Romans at this point. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, they felt like they were really part of the Roman system themselves. The Romans hadn't asked for very much. The Romans and the Roman alliance system largely held together. There were some that Hannibal was able to peel off, but not many. Furthermore, the fact that Rome had this system of alliances meant that the Romans could replenish their armies. Hannibal could mow them down by the thousands, but there was always another army in the field to face down Hannibal. Now, the Carthaginians, with their mercenary army, could probably field about 80,000 men. About a third of them were already in Italy. But the Romans, with their system of alliances and their citizen army, could field a potential of up to 800,000, roughly 10 times the size of the Carthaginian army. And this enabled the Romans to expand the war. While they were dealing with Hannibal in Italy, the Romans expanded the war to Spain, attacking Carthage in its backyard. Rome could do this because it had enough manpower to fight wars on multiple fronts. And so under their great general Scipio, they were able to attack Spain and begin to peel off territories that had been Carthaginian. And by about 208, they had conquered most of Spain. They could now begin to focus their attention on Carthage itself. And so the Romans from Sicily launched an attack on Africa. This is all while Hannibal was still in Italy. The Romans weren't able to defeat him in Italy, but they were able to keep him tied up. The Roman strategy in attacking Africa was to hopefully have Hannibal recalled, which he was. Hannibal managed to escape out of Italy to defend the homeland. But it was all or naught, because at the Battle of Zama in 202, the Romans were finally able to defeat Hannibal and to end the war, although they never were able to capture Hannibal. But with the defeat of Hannibal at Zama, the Carthaginians were again ready to talk peace. Well, Spain had already become Roman, and that was peeled off. The Romans forged an alliance with the enemies and rivals of the Carthaginians, the Numidians, and they gave vast tracts of what had been Carthaginian territory to the Numidians, and Carthage was essentially reduced to its city and surrounding countryside. Once again, the Romans imposed a harsh peace on the Carthaginians, demanding a large indemnity, and they limited the Carthaginian navy down to 10 ships. And in time, the Romans would eventually destroy Carthage itself, and what became known as the Third Punic War, but really doesn't warrant the name of a war. Okay, so the Romans, despite having their backs against the wall, came out ahead. What I'd like you to do now is to gather your notes and to think about this. Why did Rome's alliance system make the difference in its ultimate victory in the Punic War? So, if you like this video, you can give it a thumbs up, or you can subscribe to my channel, or leave a comment. And in this way, you'll be contributing to my great empire on YouTube. Until next time, I will see you.